All right. So I'll be talking today about deliberately constructing novel ecosystems in a changing world, a few lessons from 80 years of post-fire seeding in the Great Basin. So first, I guess I just wanted to kind of define novel ecosystems. This was something that was brought up by Hobbes and look at the early 2000s or in the mid 2000s. The idea is that as we have change from historical conditions to altered conditions, either through in biotic composition or in abiotic conditions, the state, it becomes more and more novel, the state of the ecosystem. And we can kind of describe them in various ways, like something that's very similar to historical norms, a system that's more of a hybrid where there's novel conditions and novel biota, and then a fully altered and novel ecosystem. And now obviously there's a gradation in this. This is a continuum and doesn't really have any specific thresholds, although some people have tried to define them. And the consequence for conservation really is sort of a triage approach. So perhaps it's the case that if we have more historical conditions or sort of a hybrid system, we might be able to restore back to historical reference states. Whereas if the states are much more altered, especially if it's altered both in abiotic and biotic conditions, we may find that restoration is difficult or impossible, or we may have to accept that some changes will be there and we'll only be able to restore ecosystem function, perhaps, but maybe not everything. So, kind of the questions that arise from this are, how do we actually determine what these thresholds are? I think often we make assumptions and we think we know, but we might not always know in many cases. I think oftentimes the novel ecosystem concept is really about accepting and working with change. However, some people have really kind of thought of it as a potential to deliberately change ecosystems. So I want to describe kind of what has been going on in the Great Basin in the last 80 years, particularly with large-scale seedings. A lot of them are post-fire seedings, but there have been fuel treatments, rangeland improvement, et cetera. So really what this is a deliberate, potentially a deliberate novel ecosystem construction over a period of time. So the Great Basin floristic region is in Western United States. It's in the Intermountain West between the Sierras and Cascades and the Rockies. It encompasses much of Nevada, parts of Western Utah, Southern Idaho, and Southeastern Oregon. It's very large. It's 550,000 square kilometers, 75% of which is controlled by the federal government. It's also topographically variable, about 750 to 4,000 meters in elevation. It also ranges in aridity from salt desert to montane scrub, 50 to 600 millimeters of precipitation. So the Great Basin has been facing challenges for some time now, starting in the 1920s when it was sort of the height of grazing. Many people started to realize that there was a lot of degradation going on, soil erosion, loss of plant communities. Now grazing it peaked in the 1920s and has declined since then, mostly because sheep and goats have actually been, there's not as much of them on the landscape. Cattle have also declined somewhat, but not as much. The big baddie is cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, which was introduced in 1894 and is subsequent into the Great Basin, has subsequently basically gone everywhere. Its abundance has also been increasing. Now I would take this particular estimate with a significant grain of salt, but looking at some long-term data sets, I kind of compiled this curve, which shows that at least from around 1920 to the late 2000s, there's been about a 93% increase in cheatgrass abundance in certain natural areas that have been tallied. Fire is also a big deal, and it actually coincides a lot with this cheatgrass increase. So as cheatgrass increase, so does fire. Fire is also being driven by climate change. There's been a roughly 54% increase since 1980 in the Great Basin. On the bottom right here, you can see all of the fire perimeters. That's all the areas that have burned since 2000. So that's 20 years of burning, and quite a bit of area has been burned. However, I should note that most of those burned areas have only burned once. And oftentimes there are areas that are burning over and over again in the same place. Those tend to be heavily invaded by cheatgrass. Some of them are also very close to urban populations. Another aspect of what's going on in the Great Basin is the loss of wildlife. We have a keystone species, the greater sage-grouse, which is very dependent on habitat, particularly for chick rearing. So sage-grouse need sagebrush, which helps protect the chicks from predation, and then a significant plant community, which also drives the which helps the chicks grow as they mature, they eat and mature. So, is this a novel ecosystem, the Great Basin novel ecosystem? I think what I've just shown is there's been a huge number of changes, some related to management, some related to climate change, some related to invasions. There's significant impacts. So I would say that yes, it is for those reasons, but also not entirely for the reasons you may think. So it's quite possible that the Great Basin is one of the largest experiments in deliberate ecosystem, novel ecosystem construction. Now, of course, that's disregarding agriculture, urbanization, and forestry, but when we think of natural environments and rangelands, I think it's one of the largest. In particular, there's been a consistent use of non-native introduced bunch grasses. In particular, the crested wheatgrass complex, the agropyron complex. And there's estimates that at least in Western North America as a whole, about 6 to 11 million hectares have been planted. Now, that's a pretty iffy estimate because the most recent primary estimates from that actually come from 1981. So we're talking 40 years ago, and there's been significant change since then. We do have better information for federal agencies, in particular the Bureau of Land Management. And so this graph shows cumulative confirmed hectares of crested wheatgrass that were planted in the Great Basin. Note that early plantings are much less likely to be available. So confirmation is going to be better for more recent treatments. And this is primarily for BLM treatments. So this doesn't include Forest Service, doesn't include state, private, which can also have significant effects. So why plant crested wheatgrass? Well, the primary reason initially was because it was good for forage. And as you noted, you might have noted, back in the 1920s, there was significant grazing effects, and people were looking for anything that could occupy land, stop soil erosion, create good forage value for the grazing that was occurring. And so that really started happening in the 1930s. The Dust Bowl actually is what triggered the large-scale use of crested wheatgrass, and some of the first plantings in the Great Basin were the 1930s. It also does well in outcompeting cheatgrass. And so as the cheatgrass invasion became more and more of an issue and fires became more and more of an issue, more and more of it was planted. It also tends to establish better than a lot of the native species that are used in seeding. And so again, it seems to have a lot of advantages. However, it also interferes with native bunch grass recruitment, even when they're co-planted. It also drives shrub abundance down. This is mostly sagebrush, and it drives down biodiversity of the plant community. Now remember, sage grouse are dependent on biodiversity. Also, in general, a lot of these treatments have been found to be ineffective at increasing the probability of sage-grouse occupancy. So something about these post-fire treatments that we're doing is not working. Now, there are multiple reasons for this, but some of them probably have to do with the seed we're using. So this is a quick description of a study that a colleague of mine and I did. We took on a study that had been set up in the early 2000s that compared native-only seedings with conventional mixes, and the conventional mixes heavily rely on crested wheatgrass. I'm not going to go over too much detail, but I'll give you kind of the punchline. So what we found is that conventional mixes really altered successional trajectories. You can see the blue lines in this case, so these are two different sites, are the conventional mixes. The orange line is an unseeded control, and the green lines are the native only mixes. There's also reference conditions. So we have ecological site description, which is the darker point over to the right, and then there's an unburned condition. And so you can see how these trajectories are definitely going in different ways, different directions. To kind of summarize all of this, between time periods, 2002 was the early vegetation transects, and then 2015 and 2017 were the ones we did. So in all cases, the unseeded controls and the native only mixes were closer to reference conditions. In some cases, in the case of this ESD reference condition, which is really a more of a historical condition, the native mixes did a very good job of going towards that reference state, whereas the conventional mixes basically didn't. There's no trajectory towards those towards desired conditions. So lastly, I just want to say, since I'm running out of time here, we have a lot of data nowadays. There've been a huge number of studies at this point looking at various aspects of using natives in restoration. And it turns out that despite what some people have said in the past, natives do work. It takes more effort to get them to work, but we've also really increasingly have more and more sophisticated tools to make sure they work. And in particular, most of the work that's being done, or a lot of the work that's being done, looks at the genetics and adaptive characteristics of these plants in relation to climate. And so we're developing predictive models to be able to use, continue to use native species and all the genetic diversity that they represent in a changing climate. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening to my talk. This is a tool we've developed. We're working on it still, but it's up. It's called the Climate Smart Restoration Tool, and you can use it to find locations for seed sources that might be good for restoration. And it actually uses the climate North America, so you can use it across North America, although all our detailed stuff is all for the Great Basin currently. All right, thank you very much.